Welcome back to Unworthy Wednesdays. Today is going to be a little bit different. Today I'm going to talk about Belarus and the Belarusians who were worthy of media coverage, why they were worthy, and how corporate news still managed to be terrible. So, in Belarus, which is between Russia and these other countries, the significance of which I will get into, on August 9th, 2020, President Alexander Lukashenko, shown here coaching Steven Seagal on how to eat a carrot, was up for re-election. And he won. He got a staggering 80% of the vote, which tells you one thing.
The opposition continues to say that they believe that the election was rigged.
President Lukashenko controls the vote counting, as well as security services and the state media.
So the results were fraudulent and protests broke out, which were naturally met with violence. Countless stories of people being beaten, snatched off the street by security forces, wearing masks, journalists getting locked up, the internet being cut off in parts of Belarus so that protesters weren't able to coordinate. Not a good situation. Now running against Lukashenko for the opposition was Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Originally, her husband was running, but he was thrown in jail on trumped-up financial charges, which of course were bullshit. Ms. Tikhanovskaya, who before the election had given up a teaching career to care for her 2 children, was thrust into the spotlight as she vowed to continue her husband's campaign. She found support from voters looking for an alternative to Mr. Lukashenko as she called for change after years of economic stagnation and repressive rule. And I don't think there's any doubt that she is better than what Belarus currently has. But obviously the idea of discussing her actual policy aspirations fall well outside acceptable dialogue. Now the election was on August 9th. The week following the election, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox mentioned it about 40 times.
In Minsk to protest last Sunday's disputed presidential election.
Including Rachel Maddow dedicating an entire opening segment 2 days after the election. That is unheard of. I mean, 250 million people protesting in India, a coup in Bolivia, election fraud in Honduras, where the brother of a cocaine trafficker is president, and the state-sanctioned violence that came after all of it. Literally not a single mention of any of those things from Maddow. But Belarus, she talked about Belarus 3 days in a single week.
You do think of an election.
Okay, so why did Belarus get so much coverage?
We're deeply concerned by the Belarus presidential election. Severe restrictions on ballot access for candidates, prohibition of local independent observers at polling stations.
The elections themselves weren't free, they weren't fair. The common objective is to support the Belarusian people.
The United States has discarded Lukashenko politically, which means safe, official sources in Washington, sources with prestige and legitimacy, have declared permission to cover this. And it's always safe to take them up on it. No need for independent investigation or to risk getting hassled by sources from the government with whom you disagreed or pushed back against in whichever way. And thus, we extend our deepest journalistic sympathy to the aggrieved citizenry of Belarus. The media approves these victims. You're welcome. Now here's the thing about Belarus. President Lukashenko has historically used the EU and the West to hedge against Moscow's influence. You see, Belarus lives right in between Russia and all these members of NATO, which if you don't know, is a military alliance between 30 countries, including the US. And Ukraine is an aspiring member of NATO. Russia has wanted to put military bases in Belarus. A strong alliance with Belarus is good for Russia. But let's say Belarus elected someone who was pro-West and unfriendly to Putin and maybe even started making moves to join NATO. Then it would be like the EU and NATO moved their border right up to Russia. If that were the case, you can almost guarantee that Maddow's audience would have no idea Belarusian security forces are punching people's teeth out like they're trying to make a necklace. Because actually, Lukashenko hasn't won a free and fair election in a really long time. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo seemed to want to work with him when the year started. But Belarusians weren't having it this time. They protested, Lukashenko went to Putin for help, and now they're worth more to us as a failed state. So with that, we have victims abroad who got some attention from the mainstream media. Not that it wasn't still flawed. The coverage still suffers from all the things that make corporate media terrible. A simplified story where Lukashenko is a dictator with no actual support, Tikhanovskaya represents nothing but the noble resistance. Any serious take on her policy is totally absent. The fact that Lukashenko may have actually received more votes is completely omitted as far as I can see, and Lukashenko's efforts to stave off privatization that plagued former Soviet states and his maintaining state-owned industries, which may have actually enhanced Belarusians' ability to protest, were written off as antiquated. Mr. Lukashenko enjoyed genuine support at the start of his rule, appealing to voters by preserving many aspects of the Soviet-era economy, including a large but inefficient state-owned industrial sector. Please don't mistake my frustration that there's ostensibly a moratorium on nuance in the mainstream media for me defending an autocrat. I'm not. Lukashenko is a fuck, and he's sending cops out to torture people in the street. But Belarusians' reluctance to join the West in privatizing everything is legitimate. And there's no reason you can't talk about both. So don't be fooled. Independent media still did a better job covering this because mainstream media's coverage is contingent upon the victim's utility to the United States, and good reporting is never going to come out of that. Since August, the New York Times has published over 100,000 words on Belarus, which is the length of a medium-sized book. And I promise that if you read all of it, you will feel only marginally closer to understanding the conflict. Jacobin, on the other hand, has published probably a tenth as much, but goes into much greater detail about the region and the opposition and the history. Indie media wins every time. But that will be all for me. Subscribe, it helps other people find this, and now let's go to...
Кушай на здоровье, это очень полезно.
It's very good for health.